We are really so delighted to have Dr. McIntyre here with us today. He will be doing a session that's a little different. He comes from a different field, philosophy and that arena, but he is well published and has done a lot of work on why science is denied, which is obviously an extremely important topic right now with everything going on with COVID, especially with COVID immunization and the effect that the deniers, resistors, whatever you want to call them, are having on the evolution of COVID and its impact. So with that, Dr. McIntyre, we really look forward to what you have to say.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, especially for having a philosopher. I'm a little bit of the fish out of water here, but I'll do my best. We don't have very long to talk, so I'm going to boil things down to their essentials. I'm going to talk to you today about the most important things to know about science denial and how to push back against it. The most important thing to understand about science denial is that it's not based on facts or evidence. It's based on identity. No one wakes up one day wondering whether there are microchips in their vaccines. Instead, this disinformation is fed to them by someone who has a vested interest in making them believe in a falsehood because it serves the interest in of the person who created the falsehood. We have to stop thinking of science denial as if it were an accident or a confusion. Science denial is not a mistake. It's a lie. So who is doing this? Who's creating the disinformation? Well, essentially anyone who has a financial, ideological, or political interest at stake. Some of the disinformation about COVID is being created by foreign intelligence. It's clear what their interests are, but some of it's also created and amplified by domestic actors who wish to see us at one another's throats. The goal of a denialist campaign is not just to create doubt, but distrust. It's intended to alienate and polarize us so that even empirical issues become a matter of us versus them. This is why science denial is a matter of identity. If you can convince somebody that even an empirical matter is a partisan issue, then you don't really have to worry about factual refutation. As long as you can paint the other side as untrustworthy or liars, then you've created an identity for your team, and that's all you need to sustain their belief. So the question comes, how do you fight back against this? Facts alone won't do. Jonathan Swift, I think, is the one who said that you can't reason somebody out of something that they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. If science denial were just based on doubts, facts might do the trick. But remember that science denial is fundamentally about distrust. Science deniers don't have an information deficit. They have a trust deficit. What's the best way to overcome distrust? It's through personal engagement, preferably in one-on-one conversations. Information can be useful, but more important is your attitude going into a conversation with a science denier. Remember that when you're challenging somebody's beliefs, you're not just challenging what they're believing, you're challenging who they are. So remember to be gentle. A few years back, some cognitive scientists found that all science deniers use the same flawed reasoning strategy. First, they cherry pick evidence. Second, they believe in conspiracy theories. Third, they engage in illogical reasoning. Fourth, they rely on fake experts. And fifth, they believe that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. There was a recent paper in Nature Human Behavior, which by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid, which provided the first solid empirical evidence to show that understanding that 5-step blueprint was sufficient to engage in something called technique rebuttal, which allowed researchers to effectively push back against someone's denialist beliefs. The interesting thing here is that technique rebuttal can be done by anyone. They also studied something called content rebuttal, which is when you're an expert in the field. but technique rebuttal can be used by anyone who's an ally of science. And what they showed is that both content rebuttal and technique rebuttal had a statistically significant effect in pushing back and getting science deniers to give up their mistaken beliefs. You'll see that my dog has just joined us there in the corner. Sorry. Now, it doesn't always work, technique rebuttal or content rebuttal. And really, it wasn't tested against hardcore deniers. The study was done online against relatively naive audience, people who are hearing disinformation for the first time. My advice, though, is this, especially if you're going to try to use this technique rebuttal out in the wild and against hardcore deniers. The best way to engage in any sort of belief conversion is face-to-face, because that's when trust is built. The essential thing is to remain calm and be patient and be respectful of the person as a person, even if not their beliefs, and to actually listen to what they have to say. Because if you listen, sometimes they'll tell you what it would take to convince them. Sometimes if the person that you're talking to is a hardcore denier, they will tell you, this is what I need. This is what I need to hear. But even if not, remember that you're building trust just by talking to someone. And trust is essential to changing someone's mind. There are numerous examples of this working in the anecdotal literature. Google the phrase, "it will take off like wildfire," and it will bring up a story in the Washington Post from a few years back, which talks about how a group of public health experts pre-COVID were dispatched to Vancouver, Washington during a measles outbreak there. Jay Inslee sent them down to talk to the anti-vaxxers, and it worked. The article talks about how after talking with scientists one-on-one, and the scientists were warm and patient and humble, a number of anti-vaxxers changed their mind. I remember one woman in particular in the article saying, I just didn't expect this person to be, so warm and trustworthy, and she changed her mind. Never forget that most science deniers are victims. They've been duped by someone, and they deserve our empathy. They're responding to disinformation created by someone else. Many of them are also afraid, and they just don't know who to trust. So by talking to them, you can be the person that they grow to trust. In my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, I lay all of this out in more detail with references, stories, and more in-depth analysis of these principles and how it all works. And I'll say one other thing in my book is I tell the story about how I used this myself when I went out on the road to talk to science deniers. I started with flat earthers at the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado, and I wanted to talk to them about their denialist beliefs. And I'll leave that story for another time. We've got 8 minutes left, and I've left plenty of time for a Q&A. So what questions do you have for me today?
Well, first question I would like to bring up, obviously, in addition to the resistance and denial going on based on the factors you were talking about, in terms of overcoming some of the things, what do you think is the effect of a mandate on people who may or may not have been resistant to begin with?
It's hard because if people are already resistant, they're going to use any excuse to back that up. Okay, so they're not going to say I'm afraid or I don't understand. What they're going to say is, don't tell me what to do. And a mandate is going to play right into that. Now, that's not an argument against having a mandate. It's just warning you that people who are science deniers, it's not an entirely rational process. It's, as I said, it's an identity process. And so if they can find other people who agree with them, who think that mandates are a bad thing, they're going to push back. I think that part of the issue, therefore, is a communication strategy. How do you talk about the mandates? I'll leave it to others, maybe with more experience in public health, to talk about that. One very important thing would be to say why, if you are going to impose a mandate, why you think it's necessary. What's the difference between having one and not?
Thank you. Anybody else online who has any questions at this point? Well, then I will do one last question.
Okay.
And that is, this whole question of trust and politics and everything else, where do you, the one-on-one I understand, but where do you go when people just do not trust the professional voices they're supposed to be listening to, whether they come, from a professional society or from the government? People have become, I feel, much more distrustful. And how do you combat that even in a one-to-one situation?
Well, the systemic way to combat it is to try to combat the disinformation and the amplification of disinformation. That's, that's a big problem. That's a hard problem, because the reason they distrust you is because they're told that they should. Okay. And I'll say this: one-on-one conversation face-to-face is the best way to overcome distrust. I felt that in talking to the flat earthers. I could not have disagreed with them more. And here I was coming into their conference, 650 of them, and me. And I'm sure that they distrusted me, but after being there for 2 days and having conversations, they listened to me, and because I first listened to them. So I think that the main way to overcome distrust is just what I talked about: being patient, calm, respectful, and listening to what they have to say. If you act like I'm the expert and you should believe me, that's poison, and it won't work. I saw some other questions that just come up in the chat, but I can't read them. Will you please?
I will read.
Okay.
I will read one that really ties into what you just said.
Mhm.
Is there any effective use for social media in addressing science denial? And then in parentheses, my biased answer is no.
Well, I would say this: there is and we all know this, there's a cognitive bias of some call the repetition effect, sometimes called the illusory truth effect. When we hear a lie over and over and over, it makes it seem more credible. The truth also needs amplification. And so I would say, for those who feel like, well, they're just lies out on the internet and it's not even worth talking to these people, it's not true. If all that you do in your conversation is just repeat the truth and that you believe it and say why you believe it, you're actually doing some good. Okay. Simply to repeat the truth is to do good in these conversations. And social media is one way to do that. If we just go back to our labs and we're right, nobody's going to hear us. And I know that the folks on this, in this meeting, you guys are at the tip of the spear. You're out there every day doing this. And it's important that, you're doing good work. Do as much of it as you can face-to-face, one-on-one, which is hard because it's not scalable that way, but it is the best possible way to convince people. More questions in the chat.
I see one here. I have noticed that repeating the lies and misinformation over and over is capable of entrenching science denial. Do you think the same strategy could be used to counter that, which I think you were addressing? But go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. My father was in World War II, and he left me one of his training manuals in something called SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And it talked about propaganda and how the enemy uses propaganda. And one thing that they talked about was the repetition effect. The repetition effect works, whether it's a lie or the truth. So repeat the truth.
All right. I don't see anything else in the chat, but I have a question that's probably controversial, but
Okay.
it always bothers me. And I'm just going to give an example, which I think is no clear answer. And that is masking and how effective is masking. And you can find lots of science to show that it's effective. And you can find lots of studies to show it doesn't have a significant effect, a minimal effect. And, who becomes the arbiter of what's fact and what's either fiction or misinformation? Somebody makes a determination that, oh, that's wrong, but it's often a determination made on something that's really in the gray zone.
I can't answer the question about who's the arbiter of what's true. I mean, my understanding is that one decides on the message and then it gets pumped out in, public service ads or, messages from the top down. But the real answer here is that whether or not somebody from on high decides that it's a fact, that doesn't mean that it's going to be believed, whatever the message is. So just remember that in communicating to the public, just saying, well, this is a fact, you should wear masks, or, you don't have to wear masks, whatever the message is, give them some nuance, tell them why, tell them how you know what you know and what you don't know. A little bit of humility can go a long way. One thing that I thought was missing from the mask debate early on in the pandemic was simply to talk about the precautionary principle, to say, this may or may not help, but it can't hurt. And then, so the people object to that and they say, oh, well, it does hurt. Really? Show me those studies. I mean, so there are studies which are equivocal on whether whether masks help or not, but I don't think there are any studies which show that they hurt. And then you've got the debate on your terms.